Hello, and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen McGrath, LLG's Executive Director of Policy and Governance, and Dennis Hall, LLG's Bulletin Editor.
Hello, everybody.
Now then, in a week where George Galloway makes a return to politics following his election in Rochdale, and 19 councils have been given permission by the government to sell assets and property due to exceptional financial circumstances, Dennis and I take a walk through the LLG Bulletin to bring you the news from our sector. So, Dennis, AI continues to dominate the sector. I asked an AI provider to produce a strategic approach to AI, and it provided me with a 10-point plan, which included a fair amount of algorithms, predictive analytics, and monitoring. But I was pleased to see a specific section on ethical and fair AI use. But what of regulation, Dennis?
Well, yes, government has now written to all regulators asking them to indicate their strategic approach to the use of artificial intelligence in their sector. The Legal Services Board have been approached as part of this exercise, and here's the detail. The Lord Chancellor, Alex Chalk, and the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology, Michelle Donnellan, have called on the Legal Services Board to publish an update by the 30th of April on its strategic approach to regulate the use of artificial intelligence in the sector. The letter, one of 8 sent by ministers to regulators in different sectors, asks the Legal Services Board to set out the steps it is taking in line with the expectations in the government's AI Regulation White Paper. The White Paper set out a non-statutory framework for governing AI, underpinned by 5 principles in order to drive safe, responsible innovation. And the minister's letter to the LSB said, the Legal Services Board is one of the regulators from whom we would particularly value an update given the significant potential impact of AI upon the legal sector. It is important for regulation to strike the right balance between risk and opportunity, and we welcome the board's insight on how to achieve this in the legal sector. And the letter sets out the information the board is expected to cover in its update. And in particular, regulators are asked to provide their current assessment of how AI applies within the scope of their regulatory responsibilities, including an explanation of their enabling legislation and its relevance in the context of AI. They're also required to give details of the steps they are already taking to adopt the AI principles set out in the government's white paper. Where possible, this should include concrete examples of the actions that they have taken. And finally, the board are asked to provide a summary of guidance that they have issued or plan to issue on how the principles interact with existing legislation and the steps organisations they regulate should take in line with those principles. Well, of course, we will report further on this. Helen.
Well, the sector can't avoid it, Dennis. So it is to be welcomed that the issues and impacts are indeed being considered. Now, in other news, new guidance on menopause in the workplace, which sets out employers' legal obligations under the Equality Act 2010, was issued last week by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. It's been increasingly talked about and campaigned on by many over the last 2 years, and of course it will affect half the world's population in their lifetime in respect of the UK and indeed Europe. That's 51% of the population. Now, the guidance states that research shows that 1 in 10 women surveyed who have worked during the menopause have left their jobs due to symptoms, while 2/3 of working women between the ages of 40 and 60 with experience of menopausal symptoms said that they have had a mostly negative impact on them at work. However, very few workers request workplace adjustments during this time, often citing concerns about potential reactions. Now, under the Equality Act 2010, workers are, of course, as we know, protected from discrimination, harassment and victimisation on the basis of protected characteristics, including disability, age and sex. If menopause symptoms have a long-term and substantial impact on a woman's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities, these symptoms could be considered a disability. If menopause symptoms amount to a disability, an employer, of course, will be under a legal obligation to make reasonable adjustments. They will also be under a legal obligation to not directly or indirectly discriminate because of the disability or subject the woman to discrimination arising from disability. So women experiencing menopause symptoms may also be protected from direct and indirect discrimination, as well as harassment and victimisation on the grounds of age and sex. And under health and safety legislation, employers also have a legal obligation to conduct an assessment of their workplace risks. Currently, we are waiting on the employment appeal judgment in a landmark case on the menopause. One Maria Rooney initiated legal action against Leicester City Council in the first tribunal case to consider the symptoms as a disability, and after several preliminary hearings and an appeal, the Employment Appeal Tribunal set a legal precedent in February 2022 when it concluded that menopausal symptoms could meet the legal definition of disability for the purposes of Section 6 of the Equality Act. The EAT therefore remitted the question of whether or not Ms. Rooney was disabled to the Employment Tribunal on the basis that it required a fresh and careful analysis of the facts. The tribunal heard the case on the 2nd of October 2023, and a decision is still pending. Now, in other news, Dennis, what do we know about the Legal Services Board?
Well, this is interesting. Matthew Hill, Chief Executive of the Legal Services Board, left his post early this month. He is familiar with being controversial, and indeed his final speech raised eyebrows about lawyers and ethics. And this was picked up in a Gazette editorial from Paul Rogerson. Here's more. Now, amid mounting public outrage over the post office scandal, Legal Services Board Chief Matthew Hill has delivered an outspoken, valedictory message on the current state of legal regulation. Now, Matthew Hill was, of course, Chief Executive of the Legal Services Board, and he proved to be an unlikely star turn at a seminar on professional ethics hosted by the Westminster Legal Policy Forum. To the evident surprise of other delegates, Hill did not hold his punches back. It is customary at a talk like this for people like me to say something like the vast majority of lawyers behave ethically all of the time. But he said, I've stopped saying this because I don't think anyone can actually demonstrate that it's true. It has become a sort of article of faith that has no real place in a rational debate about the future of legal ethics, he said. There are two statements in this debate, he went on, that are almost certainly false. The first is that all these problems are down to a few bad apples. And the second is that all lawyers are crooks. Those are his words. Hill was critical of the current solicitor codes and their prescriptive nature. Prescription, he said, risks being out of date as soon as it's written. And he went on, our previous code was very detailed on some things, but silent upon others. It is critical for us to ensure we understand the changing environment and that the profession is aware of and equipped to deal with the challenges it is facing. And Hill said regulators are lacking energy, and this comes in the context of fierce criticism of the Solicitors Regulation Authority for not acting more quickly to arraign solicitors implicated in the post office scandal. Leading post office scandal commentator Professor Richard Moorhead considers it highly likely that solicitors, some quite senior, will end up being struck off over their part in the scandal. And he also expects one or two to face criminal prosecution. Yet he cautiously supports the SRA stance to wait until the conclusion of the current inquiry. But mind you, I don't think things are all that clear. For example, it is perhaps unclear why formal actions by the SRA must await the conclusion of the post office inquiry. Surely the SRA will conduct their own separate investigations anyway, so why delay? Well, that's what commentators are suggesting. The SRA will, of course, be focusing upon in-house lawyers, ethical issues and regulatory options in the coming months. And of course, we'll be there to report further on this. Helen.
We certainly will. There'll be lots of lessons there for local government lawyers, I'm sure. Now, turning to the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. Do you remember those statements of levelling up missions, Dennis? Well, the government has now set out the levelling up missions and reporting metrics in their policy paper published last week. And they set out 12 medium-term missions to provide consistency and clarity, they say, over levelling up policy objectives. These serve as an anchor for policy across government, as well as a catalyst for innovation and action by the private and civil society sectors. Under the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, the government committed to laying a statement of the levelling up missions before Parliament, the first of which is this document I refer to. The statement includes the government's objectives to reduce geographical disparities within a period of time set out in the statement, and details of how the government proposes to measure progress against these objectives. The government will be required to report annually against its missions and metrics and lay the report before Parliament. So what are the missions? Well, and there's 12, I'm going to read them out here. Living standards, research and development, transport, digital connectivity, education, skills, health, well-being, pride in place, housing, crime, and importantly, local leadership. Now, it's worth noting that in terms of well-being, metrics will be compared to data back in 2017 to 2019. So that's before the impact of COVID. Practitioners should certainly take a look at the missions. Now then, Dennis, back to more familiar territory, the pub.
Well, indeed. And do you remember one particular pub, the Crooked House? The famous pub that mysteriously vanished overnight. Well, it's back in the news. Here's more. The owners of the Crooked House pub in Staffordshire, which was burned down and then demolished last year, has been ordered to be rebuilt in its original form after being issued with an enforcement notice for unlawful demolition. The Mayor of the West Midlands, Andy Street, said the news marked a monumental day in the campaign to rebuild the 260-year-old pub in Himley, Staffordshire, famous for its wonky floors. They've been ordered to rebuild the pub back to what it was before the fire, just as we've been lobbying for, he said. The enforcement notice issued by South Staffordshire District Council states that the building must be built back to what it was prior to the fire within 3 years, and the owners have 30 days to appeal against the notice. The council said it had engaged with the owners since the demolition, but the situation had reached a point where formal action is considered necessary. Leader of the council, Roger Lees, said, "We have not taken this action lightly, but we believe that it is right to bring the owners to account. They demolished the building without consent, and the council are committed to getting the Crooked House rebuilt." And Paul Turner, a local resident who has helped to spearhead the campaign for a rebuild, said he was absolutely delighted by the news. And he went on to say, "This is what we've been looking for, and we're really happy we've now got the law on our side. That doesn't mean, of course, it's going to be straightforward and fast. We've got the bricks stored in containers, but we don't know how quick and easy it's going to be with the compliance from the owners. So, very well done, South Staffordshire." Helen.
Very well done indeed. And I should clarify here that Paul Turner, a local resident featuring in your post there, Dennis, is not the Paul Turner from LLG, Deputy Vice President, just to be clear. So my final item today, Dennis, is a very serious one indeed, actually, and it concerns an overview of outcomes across England of the second year's delivery of the provision of support for victims of domestic abuse and their children in safe accommodation. This annual report sets out the progress made in the delivery of the statutory duty between April 2022 and March 2023. So what can we learn? Well, over 50,000 individuals have received support in safe accommodation in England, and that's up from the 36,545 in the first year of the duty. Of the total number of individuals supported in safe accommodation, 21,170 were children. This is an increase of 83% from the children supported in safe accommodation reported in the previous year. Local authorities also supported 26,830 individuals with at least one specialist characteristic in safe accommodation, and that's up from 11,740 in 21-22. Now, whilst the overwhelming majority of those supported were, of course, female, it's very important to remember that men too can and do suffer domestic violence, and councils accommodated 1,130 men in safe accommodation during the relevant period. And they provide a case study in their report from Trafford, one of the 10 Greater Manchester authorities, who identified a gap in provision for male victims, able to accommodate only one referral out of the 25 instances of males suffering from domestic abuse reported in the first year. So Trafford opened a male refuge in April 2023 with capacity to provide accommodation to a minimum of 12 male victims every year. Collaboration with key partners has ensured that male residents receive person-centred support tailored to their needs. So Felicity Buchan, who's the Minister for Housing and Homelessness, said that she was determined to work with local authorities and the sector to ensure that all victims and their children receive vital support. She went on to say that encouragingly, there are already excellent examples across England of good practice. And this report highlights just a few of those examples delivered by local authorities. It's also important to acknowledge, she said, the input of specialist domestic abuse charities in ensuring that local areas are meeting the needs of all victims, including those who have struggled to find the right support in the past. This report, of course, pertains to England only, not to Wales. And on that note, you can read more on the items discussed today and many more besides by going to bulletin number 8, available on the LLG website now. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too.